Hi folks, HR Funk here with number 45 in my series on law enforcement firearms qualification courses. Now, if you've not seen any of the previous videos in this series, you've got a lot of catching up to do. But what I'm attempting to do is to fire a law enforcement firearms qualification course from each of the 50 states for the purpose of comparing and contrasting those courses and ultimately trying to determine what I think is the best law enforcement firearms qualification course in the country. Now, this series does focus on handgun qualification courses, and in the future I might do another series on rifle and shotgun qualifications. And today's handgun qualification course comes to us from the state of Hawaii. Now, before I get started with this Hawaii course, there's a couple of points that I have to make. First off, the last few videos in this series that you're going to see, and this is number 45, so I only have 5 more, represent the courses that I had the most difficulty in acquiring. In fact, I still need a course from West Virginia, so if any of you out there have access to a West Virginia law enforcement handgun qualification course and you can get me a copy of that course, please let me know in the comments below this video and I'll let you know where you can send that to. Hawaii was also a course that I had a very difficult time in acquiring, and in fact the course you're about to see is designed for retired law enforcement officers who are qualifying in that state under the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. I was not able to get a course for, say, Honolulu PD or anyone like that. Now, since this course is still intended for qualifying law enforcement officers, albeit retired officers, I think it still meets the criteria for this series, but I did want you to know that's the course you're about to see. And I think there might be one more left in the remaining 5 that's also for retired officers. I'm not absolutely certain about that, but I'll have to look at that last 4 or 5 and let you know in the specific video when I get to it if that's the case. Anyway, on we go with this Hawaii law enforcement handgun qualification course. Hawaii uses a 43-round course of fire for qualifying retired officers in that state under the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act, and that course is divided into 5 stages that take place at distances as close as 3 yards from the target and as far away as 15 yards from the target. In terms of scoring, the 43 rounds need to strike inside of what's called the Coke bottle area of the B-21 target, so called because it more or less resembles the shape of a Coke bottle. Of the 43 rounds that are fired, only 3 rounds can strike outside of the Coke bottle area and the officers still qualify under this course. If any of the shots fired strike completely off the silhouette, the officer fails that qualification and has to reshoot the entire qualification course. So in terms of scoring on this, it's pretty stringent. Even though it's a course for retired officers, you can only have 3 misses out of 40, and if any individual shot strikes completely off the silhouette, that's a failure for this qualification course. So in case you're wondering, that scoring gives this course a qualification standard of 93%, which is the second highest qualification standard we've seen. There was at least one course that had a 100% qualification standard, but 93% is no joke. So even though this course is intended for qualifying retired officers, they still have a pretty high bar to meet in the state of Hawaii. And without further delay, here's a look at today's challenger. For this Hawaii course, I'm going to be using my recently acquired OD Green CZ P01. If you saw my recent review on this pistol, you already know that I'm a big fan of it. I'm going to be interested to see how it does on this course. I did shoot it on the Ohio course a couple of days ago to qualify for my own department purposes, but we're going to see how it does on the Hawaii Handgun Retired Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act qualification course. And I'm ready to go. The first stage of this course takes place at a distance of 3 yards from the target, and Hawaii is another one of these states that incorporates the course of fire into a 16-page document that has all kinds of information about everything else other than the course of fire. And it also has one of the most specific course descriptions that I've seen. We've run into a few of these throughout the series, and this is another one. And what I'm going to do is read you verbatim the instructions for this first stage, because it specifies everything right down to how the shooter is supposed to stand. And whenever I see these, I think for the purposes of administering the course, it makes it difficult for the instructor who's conducting the qualification to make sure all of this is met exactly as it's specified in the course description. What this says for the first stage is, at the 3-yard line, the applicant shall have a fully loaded firearm holstered. Reloading may be conducted between firing sequences as necessary. The applicant shall stand directly in front of the target with both hands held at the applicant's side. On the first whistle, the applicant shall sidestep to the right, draw the firearm, and fire 2 rounds into the chest area. The applicant shall then evaluate the target and holster the firearm. On a second whistle, the applicant shall repeat the above, but step to the left and fire 2 rounds into the chest. The applicant shall then evaluate the target and holster the firearm. On a third whistle, the applicant shall draw the firearm and step straight back and repeat the firing sequence as above. The applicant shall unload the firearm, holster, and stand with hands behind the applicant's back. And I'm not sure what happens if you don't put your hands behind your back, or maybe you only put one hand behind the back. I read these instructions, and I know why it's written that way, because for safety purposes they want to make sure that everyone is completely safe. I get that, but again, this really just seems to be taking it to another level as far as specification in this stage. In any case, from here on out, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to paraphrase what is in each one of these stages, but I just wanted you to see how that's laid out in this course with the first stage. For stage 2, the shooter is back to a distance of 5 yards from the target, and from that distance the shooter begins with the firearm in their non-dominant hand. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to fire 2 rounds into the chest of the target in a time limit of 2.5 seconds. That drill is then repeated 2 times, so at the end of this exercise the shooter will have fired 6 rounds. For stage 3, the shooter remains at the 5-yard line. This time, he or she begins with the firearm secured in the holster. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to sidestep to the right, draw, and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 3.5 seconds. The shooter then reholsters, and on a second signal to fire, the shooter again sidesteps to the right and has to draw and fire 2 more rounds into the body of the target in that time limit of 3.5 seconds. The shooter then reholsters, and on a third signal to fire, the shooter has to sidestep to the left, draw, and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in 3.5 seconds. And on a fourth signal to fire, the shooter takes 1 more sidestep to the left and has to again draw and fire 2 more rounds into the body of the target in that time limit of 3.5 seconds. And yes, I did wear myself out just going through that description. For stage 4, the shooter is back to a distance of 7 yards from the target. And at that distance, the shooter begins facing to his or her right, 90 degrees from the target. And on the signal to fire, the shooter has to pivot, draw, and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in a time limit of 4 seconds. The shooter then turns back to the right and repeats that same exercise. After the second time, the shooter turns to his or her left, and on a signal to fire, has to pivot, face the target, draw, and fire 2 rounds into the body of the target in that same time limit of 4 seconds, and then that stage is once again repeated. So at the end, the shooter will fire 8 rounds on this stage. And as you saw, I got a phone call partway through that last stage, which is amazing. I can go a month and my phone won't ring until I come out and start to work on a video, and then it'll start to ring like crazy. So in any case, hopefully I'll make it through the rest of this Hawaii course without getting another call. The 5th and final stage of this Hawaii course takes place at a distance of 15 yards from the target, and the shooter begins at that distance standing beside cover. On the signal to fire, the shooter has to sidestep behind cover, draw, and fire 5 rounds from the right side of cover into the body of the target. Then transition and fire 5 more rounds from the left side of cover into the target. Then come back to the right side and fire a final 5 rounds into the target, all in a time limit of 65 seconds. Now there is a reload required during this stage, and it basically takes place wherever the shooter has to reload. So I think what I'll do is load my first magazine with 10 rounds. So I'll fire the first 10 rounds of this stage and then reload before coming back to the right side and firing the final 5 rounds. And that's the Hawaii course, folks. And in the end, I had 2 shots that made it outside of the Coke bottle area of the target. And I believe both of these came when I was doing my non-dominant hand only shooting. In fact, I think it was the first 2 shots that I fired with my non-dominant hand. Everything else stayed inside the Coke bottle. This shot tried to make it out, but it broke the line. So if my calculations are correct, I ended up with a 95%. And I've got to tell you, after firing this course, it is not easy. And part of what makes it not easy is the fact that you know in the back of your mind you can only have 3 shots outside of this area and still qualify, and if any shot makes it off the silhouette, then you're going to fail the course. So you've constantly got that, along with having to turn and shoot and move and all those type of things that you just saw me do, and get under some relatively tight time limits, at least in the first 2 or 3 stages. And when you get back to 15 yards, and I already knew I had 2 shots out when I got back there, So I was taking my time and really placing those shots to make sure that they stayed inside the target. And it kind of makes me wonder, after firing this course, how many retired officers actually are qualified in Hawaii. I tend to think that this course has a difficulty level that's high enough that there might be some retirees that would have some problems with it. There are quite a few critical skills that are tested in this. There is obviously non-dominant hand only shooting. We didn't have any dominant hand only. We had shooting from behind cover. There was no shooting and moving, but there was moving and then shooting with the turning to face the target and all that. So again, kind of a tough course. The scoring makes it tough. The relatively small target area, that is the Coke bottle area of the P-01, adds to the difficulty. And you might want to give this one a try and see what you think of it. It does challenge you. And here's a final look at today's challenger. My P01, as expected, performed flawlessly. This little pistol is impressing me more and more all the time. I've now owned it for 2 or 3 weeks. This is, I think, the 3rd time that I've fired it. And every time I shoot it, I like it a little bit more. I like the way it fits my hand a little bit more. It points so naturally. On the first stage of this course, where I had to just come up and draw and get those shots off in 2.5 seconds after taking the side step and all that, that was really just point firing, and those shots were staying right where they needed to be in the center of the target. And that's all because of the pointing characteristics of this pistol and the way it fits my hand so well. So kudos to CZ for putting out a very fine little pistol in the P01. One other thing about this Hawaii course, apparently in honor of this course, the weather here did warm up today. It is very comfortable out, but still there's some snow on the ground. And if I turn the camera around, you should be able to see some back along the ground there behind my Jeep. And it makes me wonder if anybody has ever fired a Hawaii law enforcement qualification course somewhere where there's snow on the ground. If you know the answer to that, let me know. And that's the video for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you order anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 5% off anything you purchase from Optics Planet. See you next time, folks. Until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.